Elliot, are you still there?
I am still here.
Very good. Could you start, please, by introducing yourself and Jim?
Yes, certainly. So I'm Elliot Marseille, and I have been working in the field of economic appraisal of global health programs for the past 25 years. Major focus on HIV/AIDS, but other disease areas as well, particularly in recent years. And much of that work I've done with my friend and colleague, Jim Kahn, who's sitting to my left and will say a few words about himself.
Indeed, I've worked with Elliot for about a quarter of a century. I am on the faculty of the University of California at San Francisco at the Institute for Health Policy Studies and in Global Health Sciences. And I am the director of the Global Health Economics Consortium, GECON, which is at UCSF. Glad to be participating in this webinar.
So let me start by thanking Mead and Amanda and others at the Center for Global Development for giving us this opportunity. I can't think of a better audience to be able to present our work here in terms of, if you find us persuasive, and we are attempting to do some advocacy here. If you find us persuasive, I can't think of a better positioned audience to help lead the charge for a change in what we see as a problematic method for distinguishing what is considered and what is not considered to be cost-effective in global health. So, Mead, if you could go to the next slide, or whoever's handling the slides there. Are we on slide number 2?
Yes, please remember that there is a delay.
We're on slide 2 now.
Great. So this presentation is based on an article that we recently published in the bulletin of the World Health Organization. And I'd like to sort of tip my hat to WHO. For those of you who've had a chance to see the article, it's highly polemical, we think fair, but it's extremely critical of the standard that WHO has adopted. So I'd just like to acknowledge them for for being big enough, for having the integrity to publish something that's very critical of their own work. So I'd now like to go to the next slide and discuss a few basic points, but important ones, I think, for setting the context here. I realize that there are members of the audience who are highly expert in cost-effectiveness analysis, but I suspect there are others who have a more passing familiarity. So I want to make a few really quick, basic points that I think will set the backdrop for the rest of the presentation and the discussion that follows. The first is that there's no such thing as anything being cost-effective in an absolute term. It is a completely relative concept. Cost-effectiveness only exists in relation to other interventions. So if you have two interventions and one is less expensive for the same health benefit or provides more health benefit for the same amount of money, or both, that intervention is cost-effective, but only cost-effective in relation to the intervention that it's being compared to. And so without a way of making that determination, without a way of signifying which intervention is being compared is cost-effective, there's no way in which the cost-effective analytic enterprise can help us how to spend money more effectively, which is the entire point. So some standard method of determining cost-effectiveness is indispensable. When I say standard method, I mean some explicit method that's clear and comprehensible. It almost goes without saying, but not quite, that cost effectiveness is not the only criterion for resource allocation. We may be interested in the distributional effects of various ways of spending healthcare dollars independent of efficiency, which is what cost effectiveness is about. There may be issues of political acceptability which could rule in or rule out interventions irrespective of their cost effectiveness. So next slide. So I've intimated strongly that there's a problem here. Let me try to define that problem more clearly. and I'll do a couple of iterations of that as we go along. Many cost-effectiveness analyses in global health use a standard of thinking about what is cost-effective and what isn't that is theoretically very hard to justify, and I would go so far as to say is actually not justified. And the result is big practical problems in applying standards for determination of cost-effectiveness analysis, which greatly undermines the value of cost-effectiveness analysis as a guide to resource allocation. Next slide. So what am I talking about here? The WHO threshold was promulgated by the WHO Choice Project and is based, that work references earlier work by the WHO Commission on Macroeconomics and Health. So here's the definition. An intervention is considered cost-effective if, per disability-adjusted life year avoided, it costs less than 3 times the annual per capita GDP in the relevant country. And it's considered highly cost-effective if it averts a disability-adjusted life year for 1 time per capita GDP or less. So it is based on the income of the country, of the relevant country. So this standard, next slide, please. This standard has become ubiquitous. For those of you who read cost-effectiveness analyses, the 3 quotes that we offer here you encounter extremely frequently. I'm not going to read all of them, but I am going to read the first one so you kind of get the flavor of what we're talking about here. Here's a paper that says, in their conclusion about a particular analysis, according to World Health Organization guidelines, these strategies are all highly cost-effective because they cost less than the country's per capita GDP. So that's the standard that we're talking about. The other 2 quotes convey very similar ideas. And again, if you open up any cost-effectiveness analysis in global health, you're extremely likely, not 100%, you're extremely likely to find similar statements. So it has been widely adopted, widely used. So I've implied their problems. I've hinted about, next slide, please. So are we at the one that says, what's the problem with the WHO threshold approach? Are we on the same page here?
Yes, we are.
Great, okay. So we've identified 4 drawbacks that we consider to be not just important, but actually fatal for the continued use of the WHO threshold. The first is that important comparisons among locally relevant options are ignored. That's actually impossible using WHO threshold to look at the relative efficiency of interventions, all of which might be thresholds. The second problem is that the WHO threshold, in particular, in the way it's constructed, is much too easily attained. And Jim is going to elaborate on that issue a little bit later and spell that out in very concrete terms, what we mean by that. The third is that the theoretical basis for tying cost effectiveness to per capita income is extremely weak, and I have done due diligence to actually find the justification for it. I cannot find it on the WHO. I cannot find it on any of the published materials that form the basis of promoting this threshold, and I haven't seen it in any gray literature. If anybody knows of this and can find it, I'd very much like to see it. But in fact, the justification for this has never been spelled out. And finally, the issue of affordability and the relationship between cost effectiveness and budget is not addressed by this particular threshold approach. And so the result is that cost effectiveness analyses are far less helpful to guide policy than they could be, and can actually lead us astray. Next slide, please. So, I want to talk about each of the four I want to talk about each of the four problems that I mentioned in turn. The first one, again, that important comparisons are obscured by this income-based threshold approach. Interventions are lumped together as cost-effective or very cost-effective, regardless of their incremental cost-effectiveness ratio. In the jargon, they're ICER. So what that means is that options with huge differences in cost-effectiveness are all lumped together as being cost-effective. So we offer an example in the paper of comparing bed nets for malaria prevention, syphilis prevention, and antiretroviral therapy for treatment of HIV/AIDS. All of these three are considered highly cost-effective, and yet in comparison with ART, syphilis prevention is roughly 7 times as efficient, and malaria bed net distribution is roughly 33 times as efficient. That is to say, for any given expenditure, you're going to get 7 or 33 times as much health benefit, yet all of these are considered highly cost-effective. The relevant question is option A, for example, distribution of bed nets, a better use of limited budget than option B, for example, syphilis prevention? So the final point I want to make here is it's a little bit subtle. I can't prove that this is operative, but it's my strong sense that it has. So I offer this a little tentatively. The effect of lumping many disparate kinds of interventions with very disparate ICERs under a heading as this is cost-effective or highly cost-effective tends to suggest that the cost-effectiveness analysis as a field, i.e. the techniques that we use to determine cost-effective, are so crude and undeveloped and given to bias that it's not possible to make distinctions, even the kind of gross distinctions that I offer here in this example, and thus it subtly tends to undermine the credibility of the cost-effectiveness analytic enterprise. There's lots of methodological problems in cost-effectiveness analysis, but I am not so pessimistic as to think that only these extremely gross distinctions can be supported by the current state of the field. So now, next slide, please, and I'm now going to turn this over to Jim Kahn.
Thanks, Elliot. So we are used to thinking in our field that there are 2 steps in assessing the cost effectiveness of an intervention. The first is to determine if it's effective. Usual kinds of studies, RCTs, and so on, compare different intervention strategies to see if they have an effect on health. And then there's a separate enterprise to look at costs and estimate impact and see if it's cost effective. It occurred to us as we were doing this work that the standard has been set so high that in effect it appears that if an intervention is shown to be effective, then it will be cost effective. And we explored a few examples, one of which we presented in the paper, and I'll summarize here. In many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the annual child risk of death from diarrhea is about 1%. And that death results in about 28 DALYs. This analysis ignores morbidity. Thus, the annual DALY burden in a household is from the diarrhea is about 28 times 0.01, or about 0.3 DALYs per household with one young child. Clean water to prevent this costs about $37 international dollars per year. Now, a well-powered clinical trial can detect a change in risk of about 20%, or if it's a very large and carefully designed study, perhaps as low as 10%. If the trial determines effectiveness by detecting a 20% drop in risk, that means that the intervention averts 0.06 DALYs per year. You can see the math there in parentheses. And the ICER works out to 37 divided by 0.06, or about 614 international dollars per Dali averted. At a smaller effect size of 10%, it works out to about 1,228 international dollars per Dali averted. It's important that these results, these are fairly small effects, yield ICERs that are far below 5,211 international dollars, which is the WHO choice threshold for cost effective in Kenya. And it would be true even if effectiveness were as little as 5%. So in effect, if what we found with this example and others we looked at is that anything found to be effective will be cost effective because the standard is so, the cutoff is so high. We think it's better to delink these considerations, and this just goes along with our point to try to be more thoughtful and discerning about the use of the cost effectiveness ratio. Next slide.
So another problem that we wanted to address in the use of the current threshold approach, and I alluded to it earlier, is that the theoretical basis has not been spelled out, and to the extent that one can discern it, it appears to be very weak. There's a tacit assumption that people are willing to pay for health care up to the threshold. There's no evidence for that. The threshold is not arbitrary. That is, it's tied to willingness to pay, but there's no particularly good reason to think that the threshold is tied to income, so it's not arbitrary in that sense, but there's no particular reason to assume that that's well linked to people's willingness to pay. And in fact, I am not expert on this, but my understanding is that there's very good reason to believe that healthcare is a superior good, i.e., as people's incomes increase, they're willing to devote a larger portion of that income to healthcare. So that would imply a nonlinear relationship between willingness to pay and national income, whereas the WHO approach assumes a linear relationship. There's been some suggestion, again, I'm a little hesitant to include this. I decided to include it. Again, I can't prove it, but there's some intimation that the WHO threshold was chosen in part to ensure that ART for HIV would be considered cost effective. So finally, next slide, please. The final problem that we address in our paper is that thresholds are unrelated to budgets, and they fail to address the issue of affordability. So at the very heart of cost effectiveness analysis, and at the center of sort of the theoretical justification of it, is that trade-offs are real, that opportunity costs are real. And in that context, these concepts only have meaning if budgets are limited. If you have an infinite budget, then there are no trade-offs. And so you get into territory with the WHO particular threshold, you get into some kind of surreal territory. So if you imagine a drug that adds 1 year of life to everyone in the population and costs 1 time per capita GDP, which remember would be considered not just cost effective but highly cost effective, the result is that the entire healthcare budget would grow to be the equivalent of the entire GDP. There would be no money left for anything else in the economy other than providing this miracle drug to people. And so like a teenager at a shopping mall, you can go broke saving money, i.e. doing things that either literally save money in the short term or are considered good deals, i.e. cost effective. Next slide, please. So given these problems, which are not esoteric, I don't think these are so hard to discern, it's kind of a question how the WHO threshold became so widely used. The temptation to use it is extremely great. First of all, it's very easy to use. It requires no thinking or analysis whatsoever. The per capita income of any country that you're interested in is like 3 clicks away on the internet. So it's extremely easy to use. It has the imprimatur of WHO. Everybody else uses it. And so if you have been working hard on a paper and you're drawing your policy implications and conclusions, it's very easy to use. It's widely sanctioned, and the chances that a reviewer is going to call you to task for it approximate 0. And on the other side, for journals, many of the medical journals that publish these kinds of cost-effectiveness analyses in global health do not have economists on board, and they're happy to have a globally accepted standards that reassures their editors and reviewers that international norms are being met by the use of this standard. So the result is that both journals and authors and reviewers are tempted to choose this very convenient approach over a more nuanced and setting relevant examination of the complex issue of what is actually the best use of healthcare money at the margin. Theoretically, that's what we were interested in a given context. So we think about a couple of solutions. Benchmark interventions and league tables, both of which have the character of linking the cost-effectiveness determination more closely to the local context and at least potentially a little closer to revealed or stated willingness to pay and in the case of league tables, to budgets. So let's talk about benchmark interventions. So, next slide, please. I've got Jim here reminding me to ask for the next slide, so it should be the one that says benchmark interventions. So the idea here is that the determination of cost effectiveness can be made by the revealed preference of the country in question. That is to say, if an intervention is in wide use, people must be willing to pay it because they're paying it. So in the United States, for many years, and you still see it cited, the threshold of $50,000 per quality gain was the benchmark intervention to determine cost effectiveness. It was more lately adjusted for inflation, but it was tied to the cost of renal dialysis when it was considered to be included in Medicare legislation a few decades ago. It turns out that a senator who had a loved one in his family who was suffering from end-stage renal disease was extremely instrumental in pushing for this to be extremely instrumental in pushing for the inclusion of renal dialysis in the Medicare legislation. So the point here is that doesn't necessarily represent societal willingness to pay. It represents the outcome of a political process. So any given benchmark could be an outlier, could be unrepresentative, and it's not very reassuring to think that you could find extremely expensive interventions that are widely implemented for whatever reason and conclude that must represent the overall willingness to pay of the society in question. Then the other drawbacks to the benchmark intervention are the same drawbacks that we've outlined with regard to the WHO threshold approach. It also can obscure the differences between interventions that are below the threshold, and so on. It shares those shortcomings of the threshold approach because, in effect, it is a threshold approach. It's replacing the per capita GDP benchmark with the benchmark of let's look at what people are actually spending on other interventions. So the next slide, please. The next possible solution or area where we think progress could be made in adopting an alternative way of thinking about thresholds is league tables. The idea here is that one would array from most cost-effective to least cost-effective as large a set of relevant interventions for which data are available. And then given the budget that is associated with the program options under question, you fund the most cost-effective, and then you go down, you go to the second most cost-effective, and you proceed down this table, i.e. this league table of rankings of cost-effectiveness, until you've exhausted the budget. So that's the basic idea of a league table approach. Next slide, please. It has pros and cons. The pros are that budget and affordability are explicitly taken into account. There's no one cutoff, but rather the resource allocation result reflects the relative cost effectiveness of many interventions. And in theory, the least cost-effective option that can be funded is much more likely to represent the societal willingness to pay than is a threshold or benchmark. Because in society, presumably if it's roughly democratic and representative, that budget represents something like the willingness to pay for healthcare for that particular program area that might be relevant. Next slide, please. There are problems with the league table. In the first place, the information that you would want may be unavailable for the particular options that you're interested in. Again, to construct a really useful league table, you want a wide array of ICERs that, again, are arranged by their efficiency. That data may not always be available. A second problem is that what I refer to as a bare league table, which is to just say a list of interventions and their associated ICER. There's not a lot of information there. It doesn't give policymakers all of the context they would need for understanding how that ICER might vary according to particular situations and settings. I think there are ways in which these problems can be addressed and mitigated. The problem of lack of information could be mitigated, first of all, by over time, the collection of more information. As we've seen, there's an increasingly wide body of literature on cost-effectiveness ratios. But otherwise, the other approach is to, in an intelligent and transparent way, to borrow cost-effectiveness information from similar settings and program contexts, and apply it in the local setting, perhaps with some appropriate adjustments. The second mitigating factor, which sort of addresses the problem of this bare league table that I mentioned, is something I'm dubbing an extended league table, in which the ICER information is annotated. It's accompanied by information that helps policymakers understand how that ICER could be appropriately applied in their particular situation. So I'm thinking about information on prevalence, other risk factors, information that might suggest that the cost in their setting might be higher or lower than the published estimate that is included in the league table. Next slide, please. So I'd like to conclude by summarizing briefly that we believe that the current WHO threshold approach needs to be replaced by methods that account for budgets that permit multiple relevant comparisons and theoretically have a greater chance of approximating true societal willingness to pay. We believe an extended league table approach may be promising, is at least worthy of some thought. And we are far from lone voices crying out in the desert on this issue. I've been heartened by the resonance I've gotten from many people as they've read the paper. I think a lot of people share the concerns that we've outlined here. And the Bill and Melinda Gates and NICE in the UK are explicitly concerned with this issue. There's going to be a meeting in London later this month to assess the question of cost effectiveness, determination, and thresholds, and to begin to chart the way forward. So thank you. We'd now like to turn this over to general discussion, question and answers.
Okay, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Elliot and Jim. So I hope you're both stay with us now as we do have some discussion of what you presented. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I just received this morning an email from Tessa Ediger at WHO, who sends her regrets that she was not able to attend today or to tie in. As far as I know, she's not been able to tie in on the Blue Jeans network either. But she did send, as an attachment to her email to me, a set of responses to your paper. I think they are preparing a response to be published in the WHO Bulletin. And I thought that rather than jump immediately into my own reactions, it might be useful for me to summarize what she's written in that email to me so that you and Jim could immediately respond. Her response is actually quite short. The first point that she makes is that the cost effectiveness thresholds that WHO itself, as she sees their views, does not advocate their use in the simplistic way that they're being used in the literature that you cite and that most of us are aware of. She says that the GDP thresholds should be used only as generic rules of thumb, rather than as indicative, as prescriptive guidelines. And then she goes on to your point about the lack of theoretical foundation for such thresholds to be used in decision making. What she says is that the right way to do prioritization, in their view, is not to use cost effectiveness thresholds at all, but rather to maximize health subject to a budget constraint. They've been working for about probably almost 10 years now to develop this model, the One Health tool, which all of us can download from the web and try to use in a specific country. She says that the actual threshold for cost effectiveness in a given country, say Togo, could only be learned by applying the One Health tool to Togo to optimize expenditure of a given health budget, and then by looking at what's called the shadow price of that budget constraint for Togo. In other words, once you've done the optimization and maximized health given Togo's budget constraint, you've done that exercise. That exercise tells you how much money to spend on each intervention. Cost effectiveness has not yet even been mentioned. Then you ask the question, if the budget were to be expanded by, $1 million, how much more health would that buy? And that ratio is actually the shadow price, if you will, in terms of health, of adding more resources to the health budget. And that's the way they think a threshold should be established. In that case, obviously, it would be very specific to the country. In my example, it would be Togo, and to the budget that the health minister has selected for that country. So I think, my own understanding of the theory of optimization suggests that that's a theoretically sound view. But of course, I think your examples, Jim and Elliot, are right on. The vast majority of the literature that I've seen that uses cost effectiveness thresholds does not derive them from an optimization, but rather, in fact, imports them directly from the WHO website. And then her final point is that they at WHO believe that prioritization should be separated from the question of affordability. that really prioritization is a more elaborate process which takes into account not only this optimization problem, maximizing health subject to that budget constraint, but also takes into account the equity issues and the other issues which cannot be so easily incorporated into cost effectiveness calculations. And that prioritization is that more political and judgmental and qualitative process that uses the results of a One Health optimization exercise as only one of its inputs. And finally, she says that this work on how to optimally allocate resources inside the health sector is ongoing, and she welcomes your input, Elliot and Jim, and that of all the people around the table here as they move forward and try to improve this process. So before we go to questions around the table, I'm wondering if you would like to respond to Tessa.
This is Jim. Those are great comments. I want to comment very briefly on them in terms of the WHO not advocating the use of the thresholds in the way that they are used. That's an important point, and I think that puts us all on the same page in terms of refining the use of thresholds and all of these techniques so that they're used better. We all agree on that. In terms of developing a resource allocation tool like One Health, which looks at the various options available in a setting and their costs and effects, that is indeed, in my view, a wonderful way to go, and it's already made substantial contributions. I think there is one limit that comes to mind, which is that One Health, although fairly comprehensive, won't necessarily anticipate each and every innovation of a different way of training providers to implement some intervention or an intervention enhancement or a new intervention. And so I think I would advocate that the list of interventions be accompanied by cost effectiveness ratios that, given some new opportunity that's not already represented in the resource allocation problem, that opportunity can be placed in that context without having to change the software that runs this.
This is Elliot again. So first of all, I agree with Jim. I mean, it's very, I'm aware of the One Health tool. It's heartening that WHO is emphasizing these methods. I still think there's work to do in overcoming the addiction to the use of what WHO now is describing as a rough rule of thumb. I've used it myself. I'm not just pointing my finger at others. I've been tempted myself. But I think this is exactly the kind of direction that we want to go and that we want to explore. I agree that prioritization should be separated from affordability, not entirely, but if something is highly cost effective but is unaffordable from the point of view of a resource per country, that may be an argument for subsidies or for international support, not necessarily a reason for not doing it. So the question of what budget is relevant as you construct, let's say a league table or you decide how to allocate your money, is really critical. Like whose budget are we considering? And if you're considering international agencies, obviously the range of options is a lot greater than if you're just looking at the local budget. One other comment, yes, the inclusion of other criteria, such as sort of distributional criteria, in addition to efficiency, is actually completely compatible with the kind of league table approach. You just rank the interventions, you move something up or down based not just on efficiency, but because of these other considerations. And it's a way of being really explicit about how you want to trade off efficiency and, let's say, equity. So how much efficiency are we willing to give up in order to reach, more impoverished populations or more underserved populations? And it forces, an explicit transparent view of what that trade-off is, and I think that's a good thing.
Let me just point out that sometimes allowing for distributional considerations and the difference in the risks and the benefits of treating different subgroups of the population might lead to actually allocating more resources to a marginalized group. For example, intravenous drug users, if you weight their healthy life years the same as everyone else, there'll be a certain allocation to their protection from HIV/AIDS. But if you recognize that a very virulent epidemic in that subgroup can spill over onto the general population, your analysis, your health maximization analysis would end up allocating more resources to that group, and you wouldn't even have to. If you also believe that they're poor and disadvantaged and deserve resources for other reasons, that would even greater accentuate the allocation to them. I want to make one other comment, guys, and this is a question to you, and then we're going to open up more generally. Perhaps you're aware that the 2013 Lancet Commission article, co-authored by Dean Jameson as the lead author, with also Larry Summers and other notable co-authors, actually does seem to do, in my view, what Tessa Ettinger says should not be done. And that is, it uses cost-effectiveness thresholds in order to advocate for a much greater amount of spending on the health sector. But it does do something that you're not recognizing in your paper, I believe. It tries to justify those theoretically based on an economics literature on the value of a statistical life. Effectively, the authors are arguing that people's revealed preference for better health, preferences that they reveal through their behavior in the labor market when they make decisions which have health consequences, for example, that those revealed preferences suggest not only suggest that the value that the people themselves in countries around the world place on an extra year of life typically exceeds the per capita GDP of the country. And in the case of sub-Saharan African countries, the authors actually argue that the revealed preference for an additional year of life is more than 4 times the per capita GDP of those countries. Are you aware of that line of argument, and have you had a chance to evaluate it?
Yeah. No, the Global Health 2035 report from the Lancet Commission on Investing in Health is it's a landmark. It's a wonderful report that really establishes a vision for where we want to go. And one of the wonderful contributions of the report is to look at where we want to go based on considerations such as you just mentioned on the value that people put on having an added year of life, and then to think about how do we go about financing that. So, in other words, the commission said we think a lot more interventions, particularly extension of existing technologies as well as new technologies, will yield health benefits that people would be happy to pay for if the health budget was adequate for that purpose. And so when we say that cost effectiveness is critical when you have a fixed budget, and budgets are always fixed, we also have to add the long-term view that with the proper political will, the extent of that fixed budget will grow over time, and the Commission really advocates for that. In terms of the particular technique, once you do have a budget in a particular year, in terms of how you best allocate the resources that you have to help, I think it still comes back to the same issue, which is what are your best investments and how can cost effectiveness help with that. I think the approach that the Commission proposed to rely on how people value life or full value of life approach does have a little bit of the same problem that we addressed in our paper, which is that a lot of things look very attractive by that metric, but you can't necessarily do all of them. That's all I wanted to say.
Have we lost you? Hello?
Is our, wait a sec.
No, we're good.
Can you hear us now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think in one of your slides you mentioned that the application of cost effectiveness analysis is often like a child in the candy store. There's so much to buy and it all seems so inexpensive, especially to the child, because the child's parent is actually paying. So, and
the child in this scenario, I don't know.
Right. Do you want to say that before we open up?
Yeah, well, this is Amanda. Thanks a lot for doing this webinar, which I think is really important. But my question to you is what you're suggesting is that this extended league table approach should be the way, let's say, a government decides year to year what's in or out based on a budget constraint, which is essentially compatible with what Choice does. But the issue is probably more that's, most of these governments are taking decisions on specific technologies, technology by technology, which is why they use the ICER to begin with. And then the question is, the threshold should represent the amount of, the funding that's going to be foregone for something else that's less health producing or something like that. So and this, I guess is sort of like what Carl Claxton was suggesting in his paper about the UK National Health Service threshold. Do you have views on that? I mean, how practical is it to think about an extended league table approach applied annually where your budget increases and you move down your list to include new interventions?
New Zealand does it.
New Zealand does it. Ruth is going to talk next, but maybe we'll let you respond and then we'll turn to Ruth.
So I agree that the league table approach is a kind of ideal. It's divorced from considerations of sort of bureaucratic momentum, political realities in which entrenched interests form around particular ways of doing things. It's kind of like in the United States. What do they call it? Not sunset laws, but zero-based budgeting, where each year it's like we're starting fresh, and that's sort of a technocrat's dream, but is a very little, sort of very unlikely, in the real world. Nevertheless, I think the job of the analyst is to point the direction to optimality. And the political process, hopefully, the political process is influenced at the margins toward that more optimal direction. I'm not quite sure if I'm addressing your point or not.
New technology, given the kind of extended league table approach that you're suggesting, which is essentially choice. Like, would you choice every year and move your budget constraint down? Would you take some stuff out that falls out? Maybe some new technology is more cost effective. I don't know. But Ruth, did you want to say something about New Zealand? Or?
Well, New Zealand doesn't do it quite like that, but what they do is they rank the interventions that they've evaluated in the past year, and looking at the budget that they have, they then use an extended league table to rank them and decide what they are going to pay for and have a cut-off when they run out of money. Mm-hmm. And they do use, the Pharmaceutical Management Agency, Pharmac, has a fixed budget with a very small increase each year, and they have to fund new technologies out of savings on existing technologies. So it's very, very tight constraint that they work in. And they use cost utility analysis, and they do the ranking, and they work out where the best bang for the buck is, and they draw a line when they run out of money. Basically.
So can you give us a feeling for exactly what it means to have an extended league table? How long is the table?
Well, it depends on how many new technologies they've evaluated in the year. And they do have a notional cost effective threshold, and only the ones that fall within that would be considered, not everything. But honestly, I can't put a number on it. I'd have to go back and have a look.
5?
Or probably a dozen.
A dozen?
A dozen or more.
And the dozen means things which are currently at play.
Yeah.
So there's a path dependency.
There is a certain degree of have to pay the 60 cents.
All right.
We have to tell them to
The
mute.
voice reverberated through the southern hemisphere.
That's right. The New Zealander is heard.
I'm not even in New Zealand.
Okay, so another person I'd like to hear from at some point is Stephen. He's working actively in the cost effectiveness area.
Okay.
Is it fair to say that?
Yeah, no, that's fair to say.
So could you introduce yourself again, Stephen?
Sure. My name is Stephen Resch, and I'm from the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. And I do work on cost effectiveness and have been thinking about this issue as well, and have shared the struggle with the GDP-based thresholds. I do think it's important to note that there is a theoretical basis for them, which Mead, you've highlighted, that they are derived from BSL literature. Of course, that's mostly from high-income countries, and upper middle-income countries is where that data comes from. So in order to transfer it down to low-income countries, there's a benefit transfer calculations, which does assume an income elasticity of 1, which is an issue. And the other part of it that's difficult is that, the VSL has to be translated into a value of a statistical life year, which obviously depends on life expectancy, which varies from country to country. And so Dean's work tried to account for a lot of that, but it's not obvious how to do that the right way, and that's a challenge. But the reason it's important and why I'm starting there is that for me, I agree that once you have a health budget, probably GDP thresholds are not that helpful for deciding what to do, whether to introduce some new technology or not. I grant that. On the other hand, I don't think we necessarily want to throw out the idea of a VSL-based or some threshold like that, which is supposed to represent what people are willing to spend on health, which has to do with how much of your GDP you're spending on health. So if we just start with the health budget as it is, we don't know whether that's the optimal amount of health budget for that society. And if the people in that society are willing to trade survival for money in a certain way, that suggests perhaps that the health budget should be larger or smaller. And so there are sort of two separate questions in my mind. One has to do with how big the health budget should be, which has to do with how much the society is willing to trade money for health. And then secondarily, once you've sort of figured that out, then how do you prioritize among the options you have to spend money on, which then should be based on the budget that you've come up with. That's my...
They're different decision problems, really.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, one problem with this idealized view that I think Tessa is presenting is that I'm not aware that countries are actively using the One Health tool or any other optimization tool to solve that comprehensive problem, which I would agree theoretically should be solved. I'm not sure we're at that point yet. Maybe we're close to it. There's going to be a meeting of the HIV/AIDS modeling group on the day before the International AIDS Society meetings begin on July 18th in Vancouver. And that meeting is intended to be an opportunity to compare the One Health tool with 2 or 3 other optimization tools, all of which are designed to solve this optimization problem specifically for HIV/AIDS. Unfortunately, only the One Health tool among the competing models is actually comprehensive across the whole health sector. And we're going to be looking at a tool that's called, I believe, Optima, that's been developed in Australia. And we'll be looking at Tim Brown's model from the East-West Center, which has an optimization component, and the One Health tool, at least. I believe there's one more. So it's unfortunate so many decades into this process that we don't have in routine use, health maximization subject to budget constraint tools that might be available to ministries of health around the world. Maybe we're moving towards that, or maybe that's just too idealistic and we'll never really get there. And sort of the New Zealand approach that Ruth described, where you've got a lot of path dependency, but there are a few, there are a dozen or so issues which might be due to recent technological change, which are suddenly on the table. The idea that we might be able to use some kind of cost effectiveness extended lead table to judge only whether those should be put in or out is actually quite attractive. So one thing I'm wondering, though, is how easily we could kick things off the list. So kicking things off the list generally for governments is very difficult because of entrenched interest groups, and it would be very reassuring to believe that whatever process we consider did permit that. If you build in too much path dependency, then almost by definition, nothing gets kicked off the list. Anybody else around the table here who would like to? Let's move to Dana first before.
Dana Dalrymple. I wanted to comment on how extraordinary a session this has been. For years, I've been reading books on health economics and whatnot, and they all would preach the cost effectiveness of approach. It's amazing with the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. It was sort of like a Bible, and nobody has ever questioned it before. I've always been uneasy about it, but I wasn't exactly sure why, and never made any use of it. But I think this is a real move ahead to have the study underway and other people thinking about it. As I say, but the thing is, look back, why didn't we get at this 20 years ago? All these problems that have been raised existed then. It's just that nobody got around to focusing on them. It's a great move.
So is there anybody on the Blue Jeans Connection who would like to come in? And if so, please unmute your mic and make yourself known. If there are 20 of you who all speak at once, we'll try to sort it out. Kate, are you still there?
Hi, it's Mark Jitt here. I have a question. I think the distinction that's been made
Please
between...
introduce yourself, Mark, if you can.
Hi, it's Mark Jitt. I'm from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I'm a mathematical modeler and health economist. I think the distinction between sort of budget optimization and how much to spend on health, one based on a sort of league table approach and one based on willingness to pay or VSL, that's very useful. I think a further complication is when the intervention is being funded by an external donor, which happens quite a lot. And there's a sort of separate sets of budgets or willingness to pay measures. And how do you think this sort of approach can be extended to that kind of decision making?
Something that both Tessa and I glossed over in our presentation of the sort of theoretically ideal way to prioritize health expenditures. It's not true that there's only a single budget constraint in Togo. There are actually two budget constraints. One is the constraint on domestic revenue, which has actually perhaps a quite high opportunity cost. It's very costly and difficult for Togo to increase its domestic revenue, both politically and empirically, factually, technically. And then the second budget constraint is the budget constraint on external resources. And it's the sum of those two which jointly produce the health in the country. The shadow price on those external resources is very hard to figure out. From the country's perspective, it might be essentially zero if that money could not be spent, for example, on transportation improvement or on some other different area of the health sector than is being programmed. But on the other hand, if that money is fungible, then the Minister of Finance should consider it to be a real resource and should attach an opportunity cost, although perhaps not anywhere near as high an opportunity cost as the Minister of Finance would attach to the revenue he raises with his own sweat and tears. So I think that's an issue which the One Health tool does not address. As far as I know, none of the optimization tools I described, which are going to be displayed at this Vancouver meeting, actually does consider the possibility that there are two budget constraints. But Amanda has something here. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the question is there something that's globally cost effective? So say there's some budget that the global health partnerships have, let's say Gavi, right? And are they applying this same kind of approach to understand whether there's some globally cost-effective intervention, or do they only care about something that's cost-effective locally because the costs are shared between the donor's budget and the country's budget, right? So I mean, probably we would want to see the global donors doing a little bit of both, right? There's probably some stuff that's globally cost-effective that actually won't be cost-effective. I don't know. So these are but I think we are grappling with that because we don't see the donors using these kinds of approaches in a very methodical way. What you see is the use of the GDP threshold and cost effectiveness based on a GDP threshold being one ingredient of many that they consider when they decide whether to adopt or not. Right?
Ruth had her hand up too.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back to some of the points made in the presentation, if I could. Sorry, I don't want to redirect the discussion, but there's a kind of underlying assumption that Elliot and Jim that somehow asserting that something is cost effective implies that it's affordable, and I don't think that's ever been implied, actually. Because any sort of healthcare intervention that can be cost effective but unaffordable if the scale of treatment is large, and I think they're separate issues. But the other thing is the cost effective threshold alone, and I'm not disagreeing with the problems that you pointed out. I agree with them. The other issue is about uncertainty, because the cost effectiveness ratio, just as a point estimate, tells you nothing about the uncertainty of that estimate. And certainly, I mean, in Australia we've been using cost effectiveness analysis as a prerequisite for formulary listing for over 25 years. And uncertainty of the estimate plays a huge role in the decision, absolutely. And so does budget impact or affordability. So this is one thing I wanted to say. You said it's possible to go broke saving money. But I've always argued that cost-effective analysis is about spending money, not about saving it. And that goes to the issue of cost-effective but unaffordable as well. The Kenyan water example that you put up didn't consider the uncertainty around that cost-effectiveness estimate, and I think that's where that example might fall down. Because if the difference in debt benefit is so small, there's going to be a big confidence interval around it. But all the identified problems highlight the reasons why CEI alone should never drive a policy decision, in my view. That you need all these other considerations, and not just the sociological and the political ones, but also the technical ones, like issues around uncertainty. And if I may, the example, Mead, that you gave about IV drug users, and you mentioned that, there might be a higher value, or sort of, there might be, you see, I'm trying to paraphrase what you said, that you might place a higher value, direct more funds to that intervention than the cost effectiveness ratio would suggest, given the additional risks of transmission that would argue for it. But wouldn't that be an argument for including the prevention of flow-on effects in the original estimate of benefit, and therefore adjusting the outcome, the cost effectiveness ratio that you derive from it in the first place?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you. Sorry to go on so long.
So, Jim and Elliot, are you guys still there?
We are still here. Unfortunately, I didn't get the name of the questioner, and she faded in and out, so we weren't able to discern very much of what the questions were. Mead, perhaps you could summarize or rephrase, repeat what are some of the main points? Sorry, but that just wasn't clear.
So may I just focus on one of the things that you raised, Ruth, because
sure.
I do think it's quite interesting in context of some other things we've been discussing at CGP in different contexts. One of the points in your presentation that Ruth has raised is that very interesting example of the water intervention in Kenya. And you raised that topic, as I understand it, in order to suggest that the statistical requirements of actually demonstrating a statistically significant benefit for health for many interventions that are under consideration in the developing world, that the statistical requirement and the exigencies of, and the fact that having very large samples requires very, very large budgets. So the pressure of large budgets forces us to have small samples that are only barely big enough to be able to establish a health benefit, which is actually pretty large. We can't afford a large enough sample to establish with confidence a small health benefit. So you suggested that that sort of technical issue around the design of randomized controlled trials means that the cost effectiveness threshold is meaningless because every trial that actually succeeds in demonstrating an effect with statistical confidence will subsequently pass the cost effectiveness criterion simply because it must have had a very large effect or it couldn't have been statistically significant. So I thought that was quite a strong claim to make. I would imagine that many public health advocates would push back on you and say, of course, we're only looking at things which might eventually pass muster as cost effective. And so we're looking at things that are essentially not very expensive. And all we need is to establish effectiveness. So you're not saying anything very surprising here. But I want to come back on that because there's another way to look at this problem. And that is, how much is it worth to the international community, or even to the country of Togo, to know whether this intervention is cost effective? To know whether it's effective, first of all, and secondly, to know whether it's cost effective. Because if the potential health gains are in fact large enough, then the value of that information is very large. So I'm introducing this concept of the value of information. The value of information is very large, and perhaps the randomized controlled trial should not be powered only to detect a 20% difference, but should be powered to detect the effect which, if it were true, would justify a much larger expenditure. So it calls for powering statistical trials not based on pure effectiveness criteria, but based on cost effectiveness criteria. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you guys have any reaction to that.
And products, and research and development for products, right?
Well then, yes. That's a sort of, you can ask the same question not about the trial, but about the research itself. But do you guys have any reaction to that?
Yeah, Amit, I think those are excellent points you're making. I love your suggestion to consider powering a trial to demonstrate an effect size that is estimated to result in a cost-effective intervention. I think the dilemma remains that if we have a very high cutoff, then you have to wonder whether it's worth spending the many extra tens of millions of dollars to power your trial to get down to a few percent effectiveness. I think your suggestion, if paired with a discussion of what's a reasonable context-dependent cost-effectiveness cutoff, that I suspect will be quite a bit lower given the other things that could be done with money, then if you arrive at a cost-effectiveness threshold that perhaps is one quarter of the GDP per capita per year, then you start looking for study designs to pick that up. It might work out quite nicely. It would be an interesting set of calculations to undertake, which we may do. Thank you.
Yeah, and of course, it emphasizes all the more the point that Amanda was just making, which is a lot of this is global. The knowledge that you would acquire from doing that much larger trial would benefit many countries, not just Togo. I keep using Togo. Why did I use Togo today? C'est un pays francophone. So, Mark Jett, are you still on the line? I wonder if you want to come back on any of this.
That's very helpful. I think it's still leaves the methodology a bit unanswered, but I think that's a very difficult question, and the direction is really helpful.
Very good. Is there someone else who would like to intervene? If not, we can turn to. Pardon?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, yes. Hi, my name is Ishan. I'm currently working with Partners in Health in Boston, and I was just kind of curious to hear from Elliot and Jim about any other kind of criticisms you've received since you published your paper, and any kind of responses that you've received since you shared your thoughts on these cost-effectiveness threshold kind of criticisms. I know, Mead, you mentioned a few of the responses that have been received from affiliates at the WHO, but if there are any other kind of, I'm just curious to see what other pushback you might have received.
Do you mean criticism of our arguments or criticisms of the threshold approach?
Criticisms in response to your paper.
I have to say, the answer is no. Generally, what we've heard is, I'm really glad this is out there. I've been thinking along similar lines. It's great to have, it's great to have this conversation, and so we are hoping to. And the conversation's ongoing. We didn't instigate this conversation, but we're hoping that we are adding some momentum to it. But to answer your question simply, no. I think people, look at these arguments and generally agree with them. So yeah, the response has been quite positive.
I would add that the thoughtfulness of the responses in this webinar have been, at a higher level than what we've heard informally. So it's really nice to have this kind of a setting to have people scrutinize what we've said.
This is Elliot again. The only caveat I would make to what I've said is we've gotten a little bit of reaction of people who are wary of cost-effectiveness analysis as a tool for decision making, and I think there's been at least a couple of people who sort of misunderstood our paper as a criticism of cost-effectiveness analysis, whereas it's what we're trying to do is strengthen the techniques and concepts that we bring to cost-effectiveness analysis. We want to strengthen it, not undermine it.
Great, thank you.
You said that quite clearly at the end, Elliot. That's quite helpful. So perhaps if there are no other comments around the room, I want to say, I don't know if you guys can see because of that power outage you had at your house, Elliot. You probably can't see us on the screen, but we haven't had a single person get up and leave yet, as far as I've been able to notice. So everybody's remained very interested around the table here, and we have quite a few people. How many people do we have on Blue Jeans?
Right now, 17, but it was filled at capacity yet.
But we actually had 30 at one point. My goodness. So this was a much more popular topic than I think you anticipated, Elliot. Congratulations, Jim and Elliot, on your excellent presentation. And thanks for joining us here at CGD virtually. We hope to see you all in person before too long.
Thanks for your excellent hosting, Mead.
Yeah, and thanks again for the opportunity. This has been really great for us. So our appreciation.